Okay, welcome everyone. I'm happy that we have a special guest for our today meeting of our seminar. It's Yoed Kenett from Technion from Haifa, and the topic of his presentation will be the empirical investigating the complexity of aesthetics. So we will have a presentation and then the Q&A session. So, Yoed, thank you for your welcome, and the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Sebastian. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm really happy to talk to you all about my work, and especially, I think Jacek will be happy because this is the talk I was supposed to give a while ago, and unfortunately, the situation in Israel, well, they are still quite chaotic, but oops, I don't know. Anyway, so I can't see any of you, so if you have a question, just please ask. And I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Yes.
Fantastic.
Right,
yes,
perfect.
we can.
Okay, and I'm being recorded, so I have to be on my best behavior, right? And I wanna start off with an acknowledgement and a caveat of who I am and what I am. And the most important thing is that everything I'm going to be talking about today is work that I did as a postdoc with Anjan Chatterjee, who is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania and leads the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics. And I say that because I'm going to be talking about aesthetics, but I don't know a lot about aesthetics. I'm a cognitive scientist. I'll talk a little bit about what I'm interested in. And I wanted to use this opportunity to talk about what we can do or things that I'm interested in and how the research I do, how it potentially could be a starting point for a dialogue or a discussion or opportunity across different fields, okay? So keep that in mind. This is also already for me a caveat to say that maybe or likely a lot of your questions I would not really know how to answer because again, it's not content-wise my topic of expertise, but I will get into that very soon. So this leads me to the thing that I am most interested with, which is this issue of complexity. Right, so thinking is complex. I hope everyone here will agree on that. Our thinking is very complex. It's very intuitive, right? We don't spend a lot of time thinking how it is that we are able to think so fluidly and act in complex behavior like aesthetic perception or in general, what I'm most interested in, which is high-level cognition, our ability to behave in complex ways, topics ranging creativity, intelligence, and other sort of adjacent topics. Great. So over the years, this was an issue that was hard to study, this sort of complex behavior. A lot of effort throughout the 20th century and still today has been focused on what some people would call lower level cognition, right? Language, perception, action, etc. But I want to focus on this issue of complexity and show a different approach of how or thinking and how to try and directly and empirically tackle this complexity. And the lab that I lead at the Technion is called actually the Cognitive Complexity Lab. So this is in general thing that I'm most interested with. And to do that, actually, my research has two complementing sort of direct or flavors to them. And the first, which is a lot of my research, what I do is using computational tools in empirical research. And these tools come from different fields, network science, which I will mostly be talking about today, natural language processing, machine learning, AI, etc., to try and quantify and understand and sort of these abstract concepts that all come so naturally to us. A lot of my research focuses on creativity, which is why it's first. I won't talk a lot about creativity unless anyone wants to. I have lots to say about creativity. So, but similar sort of aspects, right, of memory, intelligence, language, and aesthetics. So this is now aesthetics. In general, my research focuses on the role of knowledge in thinking. Yeah, and I will talk a little bit about what I mean by that throughout some examples. But then, so this is the first part of the things that I do. And then the second part is using these insights or using these tools in empirical settings that range from classic cognitive psychology all the way up to neuroscience and all these sort of 3-letter to 4-letter terms that we can talk about. I won't be talking a lot about or almost at all about this sort of empirical neuroscience research, but I can if anyone wants to ask about it. Okay, so please do. So this is one way to characterize my work. And another orthogonal way is the types of issues that I am mostly focusing on in this still very broad and maybe coarse, confusing domain. And as I said, I'm a cognitive scientist, so most of my work is cognitive. I'm interested in sort of reverse engineering how we think. And a lot of my research focuses on the structure of cognitive systems, specifically memory and language. So how is the way that our memory is organized allows us to think creatively, allows us to appreciate aesthetics, allows us to search and find, retrieve words that in sort of goal-directed search. Most of my research focuses on representing knowledge of individuals and groups in relation to sort of behavioral assessments, like, again, creativity, intelligence, etc. And then the second part of this cognitive research is on processes. So how do we search our memory? How can we search, how can we actually study that empirically? I won't be talking a lot about that today, but I, again, also have lots to say about that. And then other types of issues in the sort of processes, which ask questions like, how does our memory change with time and context? How does aging impact our knowledge? How does problem solving impact our knowledge? Et cetera, et cetera. What happens when we communicate and learn and talk, and hopefully you're listening to me and thinking and paying attention, and that may create interest and create connections in your memory system. And then how do we actually can assess that? In parallel to that, we can ask the exact same questions at the neural level. Again, I won't talk a lot about that, but we can ask questions about the structure of the brain, or what brain regions relate to aesthetic appreciation or creativity. Is the creative brain wired differently than less creative brain? And these sorts of questions, structure and function. And also then we can also ask similar questions about neural processes. How can we look at the neural dynamics that unfold over time when we are feeling happy, when we are at awe, when we are coming up with insights and innovative ideas, right? So there has been over the last, well, many years now, but at least 5 to 10 years now, the introduction of computation tools coming from very different fields into empirical cognitive neural psychological research has really pushed forward a lot of really exciting directions. And I think these are really exciting times to ask really cool questions that were much harder to ask in the past. All right. So what I want to focus on, and all the examples I'm going to be talking about very soon to make things hopefully more concrete, is based on network science. Network science, that is also sometimes referred to as complexity sciences, is a multidisciplinary field that has sprung from mathematics, from a branch of mathematics, graph theory, but also from adjacent fields, physics, statistics, computer science, and also social psychology. And it offers quantitative tools to computationally represent complex systems as graphs. Okay? And then once that is done, using a lot of different quantitative metrics to quantify the properties of these networks or systems, right? To date, network science is used across all fields of science, from the humanities to the natural sciences, and it's really revolutionized many different fields. One very complex social networks and infrastructure and transportation networks and biological systems, gene networks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one extremely complex system that most people love is the brain, right? So the brain, 100 billion neurons, connecting to each other in extremely complex ways, and the introduction of network science tools to study the brain structure and function has completely revolutionized how we are now understanding and studying the brain, to the point that there is a branch in neuroscience that is now called network neuroscience, completely changed how we are able to study the brain. And there's lots of amazing research and methods and people doing this line of work in this subfield. But as I said, I'm a cognitive scientist, and I am more excited about the mind, our mental capacities, our mental cognitive systems, and how to try and study and represent them. And when I started my PhD a while ago, I started to be interested in using these network science methods to quantify cognitive systems, because my PhD involved empirically studying a prominent theory in creativity that's called the associative theory of creativity, that argues that more creative people have a different memory structure than less creative people. And this is what got me interested and familiar with these network tools. And I wanted to start using them to study cognition. And I was surprised to find at the time, this has changed, but not to as much as extent as it should have, that at that point, about 15 years ago, there wasn't a lot of work in using network science to empirically study cognitive phenomena of thinking. And I see surprise because if you go back all the way to the origins of classic cognitive theory on memory and language, then you see it used already a lot of network terminology in it, but just in a very theoretical context. So this figure on the right is a figure from the classic paper on the most still today prominent model of how our memory is organized. It's a paper that was published in 1975 by Collins and Loftus, and where they argued two things that are both very important to my research, which is that memory is organized as a network, like we see here, and these concepts are sort of nodes, we'll call them nodes. And these concepts in this theoretical abstract memory system is organized according to a principle of overlap of semantic features. So the more two concepts are similar to each other, the more they share semantic features, the more they will cluster across these groups into categories and subcategories, colors, vehicles, animals, etc., etc. And this builds a network, but with also structured cluster representations of knowledge. The second important aspect in their argument, in their theory, is an argument for a mechanism, which they call the spreading activation mechanism. I hope some of you have heard about this. This is the idea that when we think of a concept like red, that concept is magically activated with cognitive energy, and that cognitive energy spreads or diffuses randomly to all of its directly connected neighbors or nodes. This activation continues but decays very quickly over time and space. This mechanism, the spread activation mechanism, accounts still today for the most basic concepts in cognitive psychology: semantic priming, associative thinking, things that are so basic in cognitive psychology of language and memory. So this is a network representation of concepts and a process that operates over them. Okay, this is a theory, but if we jump about 40 years, well, 35 years into the future, which is the past already, I have been using since the beginning of my PhD and in empirical fashion to represent networks, empirically derived networks of groups or individuals. This is an empirical network from a large data set of words in Hebrew. And we do so by simple tasks. The simpler, the better. So one of the main tasks that we use to do this is free associations. And we have groups generate just whatever comes to mind, concepts, and then we use to quantify the similarity of these concepts based on this sort of the co-occurrence of responses. Or we can have people generate a semantic fluency task, which is just say all the animals you can think of. And then we can represent the category of the animals for a group. We can also do this for individuals using similar simple psycholinguistic tests. So we have now extremely powerful computational tools to work to process simple psycholinguistic tasks, empirically derived tasks, and try to tease out the signal from this data, which in the past was very hard to do. Okay. Once we can represent an empirical network such as this, then we can ask, we have a lot of power in the questions that we can ask. We can ask questions about the general structure of the network, how much the network is organized. We can ask questions about different components to this, these sort of clusters or communities, maybe 1, 2, and 3 sub-communities. Or we can ask questions about specific nodes and the connections. What are the most important nodes in the system? Centrality. Okay, what are the most important parts in the system? Right? So there's many, many different network measures. Here are 3 just examples of 3 most commonly used network measures. The first is called the clustering coefficient. It is a measure of connectivity. And what it measures is how much the neighbors of my neighbors are related to each other. So it's a measure of connectivity. And the more everything is connected to each other, the more random-like this network becomes. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Another measure is the issue of distance or path. So we can measure how many steps you can take from point A. You need to take from point A to point B. Okay, so there are many paths. We can go like this, we can go like this, we can go different paths. And what is usually measured is the shortest path length between any 2 points in the system, and we average across that. And that leads us to the average shortest path length, which is the measure of how much the network is condensed or spread out. That is important, again, if you remember what I talked about, the spreading activation model, which is a diffusion model that ends very quickly. So the closer everything is, all nodes in the network are, the easier it is to get to activate them. And so this issue of activation is important. And the last is this issue of modularity or communities. How much does the system break apart into communities? So these are just examples of 3 measures. We'll now briefly, we'll return to them very, very soon. So we can use all of this powerful tools to study pretty much anything. This network science approach is agnostic to the data. And as I said, it's been used now in very different types of data sets. So all you need, if you want to do this network analysis, all you need to come to talk to me about is what are your nodes in the system? Here it's words, but it can be brain regions, it can be people, it can be computers, it can be anything. And a way to define the edges between. That is the hard part. Usually how to define the relation between the nodes is more complicated and more open. But if we have a way to define both of these things, the components of the system that you want to analyze and how these components relate to each other, then you have a lot of available, accessible computational methods to analyze these data and start to, I want to argue, uncover very unique insights that were and are hard to uncover in different ways. And to try and better emphasize that, I want to briefly give 4 examples of the breadth of the work that I've done in aesthetics. Again, a lot of my work is on creativity, but this is just glimpses of what we can do, hopefully to create a conversation. So I will say again, as I said before, I'm not a content expert on these topics that we'll talk about. I just want to show you examples of how we can approach complicated questions in different domains that relate to aesthetics. The second thing is that each of these papers involves a lot of moving parts to them, and I will only focus on one specific thing to leave enough time for discussion. At this point, I want to say, if you have any questions, please ask now or throughout. You don't need to wait till the end, but you can, obviously. So if there's any sort of clarifications, please ask. Again, I can't see you at this point, so I'm hoping you are still following along. All right, so let's just begin a journey of different sort of examples. I will try to explain what the topic is, how we are trying to, what type of network we're trying to represent, and what that hopefully that allows us to better understand in this specific question. Okay. So the first is the first example is the first big project I did on aesthetics, and I think it's an example of something that I am now very much advocating for. And the thing is, and this is the paper that came out about 2.5 years ago, and beauty. So there's two problems that we're trying to tackle in this project that was funded by a nonprofit organization that tries to enhance well-being. So this issue of beauty and well-being, both of these concepts are extremely ill-defined and are extremely important. So beauty, right? What is beauty? Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. This is an issue that people have been obsessed with all the way back to the time of the Greeks and Plato, etc. And it's extremely hard to define what is beauty. There's no good definition for what is beauty. This is one big problem. The other big problem is this idea of a new term, or what we want to argue is a relatively newer term than beauty, that's wellness. Wellness in the US is also a very important issue that people are very much obsessed with, millennials especially. And they want to constantly enact in activities that enhance their well-being. And then there's a question then, what is the relation between beauty and well-being? When can we use one to try and enhance the other? Another sort of question we want to ask is, how do people of different ages understand these concepts, right? Because again, this was project funded by a nonprofit organization that wanted to better understand how it can promote whatever they are interested in, specific ideas of how to talk about beauty and wellness across different ages. Okay, so what we are trying to do is understand the conceptual relations between these two very abstract concepts, and I will talk about how we are doing that, and then ask whether this sort of conceptual space or network, or what I'll call semantic network very soon, changes across age generations. Is my representation, right? I'm at the 40-year-old range, so my understanding of beauty is similar to how my kids who are still young understand what beauty is. This is really important because then it allows us to ask quantitative questions on how to understand, promote, and how people are processing these meanings. So to do that, again, there's a lot of different parts. I'll just briefly talk about what we did. The first thing that we did is we went to a language model. This is Word2Vec, right? This is now so antiquated compared to language models and ChatGPT, etc. But we use a language model, Word2Vec, to try and identify a list of words that relate to beauty and another list of words that relate to well-being, wellness. And then we had another third category, which are words that are equally close in a semantic space to beauty and wellness. And I will talk about that soon. Okay, so we wanted to have 3 different lists of words. Okay, and that can generate these words for beauty, wellness, and sort of mixture. So we have different words, each characterizing each one relevant or related to each of these 2 target concepts of beauty and wellness. Okay, we have 47 words, 47 different words. Now, what we do is we use these 47 words in the following manner. We go to an online crowdsourcing, Amazon Clinical Turk, and we collect data from 4 different age groups. Right, Generation Z, 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds. And in each of these groups, right, we have quite a lot of the participants across the study. We have them they all do the exact same thing. They see these 47 words, and for each of these words, they have 1 minute to generate whatever they can think of for each of these words. And then they do this 47 minutes. It's a long study. And then we're going to use this data to represent the organization across these concepts, these 47 concepts. We're going to create a map or a network for these 47 words, and we're going to ask different types of questions, because in essence we can carve up this data in any way that we want. And this is actually what we did. So we looked at all of the data collapse across the age for these 47 words. We looked at age-specific 47 word networks, and we also looked at sex, males versus female network representation of these concepts. This allows us to quantitatively ask different questions about the relation of beauty and wellness, okay? And for each of these networks, we're going to ask these metrics, the clustering, distances, modularity, etc., etc. So the first thing that we did, again, is this sort of collapsing across all of the data. We're just taking all of the data and we're asking, how does it look like? What are these networks? How do the concepts relate to each other? Because it could have gone in different ways. And what we find is these two communities, 1 and 2. And in each of them, in the center is wellness. This is wellness here, and this is beauty here. And we find a very clear separation of what beauty and wellness means. And this was an empirical question, because in the start, we didn't know how much beauty and wellness potentially overlap. So our data shows or argues that it's very separable, and that for the topic wellness, it's mostly about wellness-related words. And for the topic of beauty, it's a mixture of words that are very strongly related to this issue of beauty, gorgeousness, wellness, eloquence, sexiness, etc., but also words that are more about more sort of abstract ideas of beauty. Education, as an example, is an interesting concept. So this sort of answered our first question that we were interested in. And then we said, okay, how does this break apart into different age generations? And this is what we found. So we're now doing the exact same thing, but just doing this for each of our age groups, which were about 100 subjects in each group. And these are the networks. So younger, less younger, and older, right? Generation Z, millennials, baby boomers, and Gen X and baby boomers. And what we found is this really interesting thing. We do, I hope you see that as people are aging, sort of as we are moving into older folks, the networks become more and more separated in these clusters or modules, okay? So this sort of separation becomes more and more evident across that. What we find here when we collapse across all the data, we do find that younger people notion of beauty and wellness are closer together as we actually predicted. And we can look at the network measures that I've talked about, and we find, and this is typical in other domains that we find in relation to creativity, for example, is that as people age, their networks become more and more organized. So they have less connectivity in the networks, they have more distances and more of these communities. Okay, things become more and more organized and separated from each other. This is a finding that has been shown in aging research in different studies. Also, I have worked on aging. So as people age, their understanding of these meanings become more and more separated. This means—
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
Because I'm from this older generation.
Yeah, I do.
So
I make no personal specific claims on anything here.
So the question is there a matter of age or the concepts which were at the time present? Because maybe the concept changed as well. So,
right. Sure. So again, one way to tackle it. This is a really good question. At the end of the day, we can look. I don't. A way to address that is to look at the types of responses people are generating. My suspicion is that they are fairly similar, in the sense of across the age groups. For the word beauty, people say generally similar things, because we didn't find a lot of variation across the networks. All we are really finding is that they're either kind of closer together or farther apart. But this sort of structure stays very stable. Surprisingly, we find that this network organization is much more stable than we thought it would be. But I think it's a really good question that I don't have a good answer for. We have ways to test for that, though. And another sort of issue that we had a lot of grief on trying to publish this work, because people have a lot of very strong objections to this separation into different age groups or cohorts or these generations. So work that we have done also And a different line of research is we're looking at aging individual networks and asking questions like that. But yeah, so I'm segueing into that. So just, and I think this is a really good example of the questions that this opens up, right? In the sense of, can we look for that? Yes, we can. We have ways to quantify these ideas, and we can look at the sort of the similarity in the responses. We can carve up different types of ways to try and represent these networks similarly. Another thing that we did that I'm not showing here is that we're looking at, again, the male versus the female types of networks for aesthetics and for beauty versus wellness, and we're finding interesting things. Another thing that we did that I'm not showing here, and I invite you all to the paper, is we're looking at the, we're taking each of the target words, beauty and wellness, and for each of our networks, because we do all these different types of networks, we look at the direct neighbors of the word, because based on the theory that is the most prominent, important thing in all of these language models, even with ChatGPT, the idea is that this is called the distributional hypothesis. You can tell what a concept is by the neighbors that shares it. So we want to see what are the neighbors, direct neighbors of beauty and wellness across different age groups, across different sexes. And this allows us to start quantitatively sort of map out what concepts mean. So we don't know what beauty is, and we probably won't be able to understand or have a clear, agreed upon definition, but we can look at how people are thinking about related terms and try to build a sort of communities of what a person means. And that helps us to say, okay, if I want to, in an implied way, to better explain to an older person what I'm trying to convey, this sort of information, why it's important to I'm trying to, whatever, then the types of terms that we use or what we're trying to sort of activate in their conceptual memory is really important information. All right. So yeah, I pretty much said that. And again, using these qualitative measures, we find differences in the sort of the segregation, the separation, and relating to the baby boomers, and that and also all these sort of insights on the specific neighbors and how they change. So for example, for females, this was a very exploratory, the sex networks analysis was extremely exploratory and post hoc. But what we find, and I said this before a little bit, that for females, a direct neighbor of beauty is education, and that wasn't true for males. That were more about sort of more external, physical terms of beauty. And I think that's again potentially conveys or opens up interesting future lines of research. All right, cool. So that's one thing that we can do. We can start mapping out conceptual representations of ideas and notions, and then compare across groups or individuals and try to better study them and gain insights on these abstract notions. And we have ways to quantify these notions. All right, great. So that was part one. Part two is a study that I had a very small role in, but I think it's a very clever study and also demonstrates the potential of using quantitative methods like network science to cut across different domains of research. So this is the paper that came out in 2020, and there's lots of authors, and I had a very small role in which I will talk about right now. The idea in this paper, that this paper focuses on architecture, and what it wants to ask is, well, there's a lot of questions here, but overall, it tries to ask is, are there different psychological domains that people are more sensitive or tuned to when they are in architectural buildings or settings, okay? So if we want to, from an architecture perspective, build a building or design a building that is best suited for people's functioning, then what should this building, should this building be designed? Are there any specific aspects to it that cognitively and neurologically a person is more tuned to? And okay, I'll explain what all of this does. So the way that this worked, or this project worked, and then hopefully that will be clearer about what we're trying to ask, is the following. Again, this is an online study well, this study has three different sub-studies in it, but overall, the participants, a large subject pool, also online, they saw a lot of pictures of different buildings or different sort of architectural settings like these. And these architectural buildings differentiated across all these dimensions: open, closed, natural, whatever. Again, I'm not really keen on all these issues. And then for each of these pictures, right? All participants, they saw a picture, and then for each of these pictures, they had 16 dimensions that they rated each of the pictures on. Okay, and these dimensions are dimensions that are important in visual and design issues of architectural design, like the complexity, or the curvature, or all these sort of issues that you see here. Okay, and then the author, the first author, the leading author, he was a PhD student at the time. He took all of this data and he just computed the correlations and created this big correlation matrix of the features of these 16 dimensions of architectural psychological appreciation or sensitivity. What we are interested in is asking, are there specific dimensions that we are tuned to that can generate insights of what are the optimal sort of architectural buildings to construct? Okay, and this is based on this sort of data, just these sort of, here's a picture just rated on all these 16 dimensions. Now, from a network science perspective, when I get a squared matrix like this, then a lot of the hard work is already behind me, because then we use this to represent the organization of these 16 dimensions. Okay, this is where they asked me to sort of whether I can work on the data that was already collected and analyzed. Because what they did was they took this 16 by 16 dimensions and they wanted to reduce it to a minimal set of components, right? They use factor analysis to compute the factors that best represent the data. Because again, the question is, are there specific psychological sensitivity to architectural designs? So this is what they did. But if you know dimension reduction approaches, one of the biggest limitations is that it's very hard to interpret what these components or factors are. Okay, so I said to the folks there, challenge accepted, give me your data and I'll see what I can do. So they sent me the data, I represented the network and then computed the communities of these 16 dimensions, which are now nodes. So in the previous network, this is just a preamble to this, in the previous network, nodes were words, concepts, and the edges were based on free associations responsiveness. In this specific network, each of the nodes are one of these 16 dimensions to these images. And the edges are now based on the similarity of how people are rating across the entire data. What we find in this sort of, I think this is a cool network. We find 3 communities and we see how each of these dimensions now are organized within these communities. And I think what was really exciting at the time was to find that these 3 components actually match perfectly on these 3 communities. So what we found here and what other people have shown in more psychometric analysis of networks compared to other dimension reduction approaches is that a network approach is a network community or community structure of networks are equivalent to dimension reduction factors or components. But what I want to argue is that they convey more information because we also see what are how the relation between these concepts, nodes are, and then we can ask follow-up questions on the specific nodes and the importance, as I said before, and other types of questions. Okay, so community analysis and networks does not compete or replace dimension reduction approaches. It just complements it and enriches this approach. So you can take any sort of multidimensional data and compress it as a network compute its communities, and these communities do in fact correspond to a standard classic components. But then the last thing that I think is the coolest part of this specific study. Obviously, the network approach is the most exciting part. But then the lead author went to a previously MRI study and showed that actually these three components that they found through, again, dimension reduction process, and I replicated in this network approach, also that the brain is sensitive to these three dimensions, right? So the study, I think what is exciting about, well, again, from various reasons, is that it showed how we can use computational tools. I would want to highlight the issue of the networks aspect to represent it, to cut across behavior, psychology, cognition, and neural domains. And right, it's been very hard in the past to build studies that can cut across these different sort of independent or parallel levels of analysis. And now using these computational tools, we can actually ask quantitative questions and better relate them to different signals, cognitive versus neural, etc. The other thing is, again, from a content version, these communities resonate with issues of architectural appreciation, hominess, this is like a Danish term, coherence, and fascination. Again, I don't know a lot about this domain, but this made a lot of sense at the time. And anyway, so this is just this is a second example of what we can do. We can take multidimensional data, whatever it is, and networks allow us, a network approach allows us to try to better understand its structure and its dimensionality. And I think that's really, really exciting. And also, again, is able to use to cut across different levels of analysis and converge different signals together. I'll talk about a little bit about that at the end. Right. So that was part 2. All right, part 3 is another example of things that we can do. And this is the different challenge altogether. This is now about abstract art paintings. Again, I didn't know a lot about this. And this is a paper that also came out about 3 years ago. But when at the lab that I was working on with Anjan, he had a visiting scholar, Gregor, from Germany, who studies abstract art. And Gregor's work is taking, I'm going to skip that, and I should have done this reverse. And taking abstract art, like these pictures, Rothko and Jackson Pollock and others, and using image statistic methods to analyze the statistical properties of the images. Okay, so this is completely a vision analysis based approach, and what they call global image properties of the art. And right, so, and why is that interesting? Because again, I learned about this when we were at the time talking about all of this. Abstract art in principle are considered to be a void of sort of content-based verbal descriptions of the art. It's very hard to define what is art, right? At the end of the day, Rothko is just squares on squares of color. You know, is there anything there? And you know, Jackson Pollock is another good example. It's just ink blots on paper. Again, I'm not diminishing their significance and value, etc., etc. Just there's this sort of sense that abstract art paintings are in principle and by default, by planning, not include a lot of sort of the ability to verbally describe their meanings. So the sort of question that we wanted to ask in this paper was, can we better understand that, whether that's true or not? This is the sort of the general starting point where we ended up, and what I think is a really nice project, because Gregor had a really interesting data set. And in this data set, he had data for 79 abstract art paintings, like these two, and other sort of 79. So 79 altogether. For each of these 79 paintings, let's say, call them paintings, he analyzed their image properties. So there's all these statistical methods to look at how much there's entropy. So this has a lot of entropy in it, a lot of noise, and this has minimal noise. There's colors, schemes, other sort of questions that are big in sort of the vision world. This is the statistical properties of images. So he had all of this information for each of these 79 art paintings. A second thing that he had for these 79, he's having a cohort of subjects look at each of these 79 paintings and verbally describe what they think about them. So in a sense, that's association study that we talked about for the beauty and wellness. Okay, so he had 79, a lot of descriptive verb descriptions of these 79 art paintings. And the last thing that he had from a separate cohort of folks, from a separate sample, is people that saw these 79 objects, and all they rated was how much they liked these art paintings, how much they preferred to see them. So we have, and this was important because what we did is the following. We are taking this information and we're taking this information and we're going to create different networks of these 79 images that are either based on this image process information or either based on this sort of verbal, cognitive information, semantic-based information. And we're going to compare these two networks. We're going to see that in a second. And we're also then going to ask whether anything about the network properties of these two spaces, how much it can predict preference, subjective preference of these networks. Can we use this network representation to better predict or understand why some people really like Rothko, whether compared to why some people really like Jackson Pollock? Okay. And this is, again, so there's a lot of information. That paper ended up with having 3 different studies in them and lots of different things that we looked at. But I think, obviously, this is the most important figure, which is our network representation. So each of these nodes is one of those 79 abstract art. So these networks are comparable because they both have the exact same nodes, and the edges are represents different types of information. Here it's the semantic, the sort of verbal representation descriptions of these abstract arts, and here is based on this image properties. And we also sort of separate them into these communities. We did this community analysis, similar to what I talked about in the previous project. That's not that important for this paper. What we then did is we looked at each of these nodes, each of these images, and we looked at different now local level networks for measure. Sorry. So for example, how many edges does each of these nodes have? How much is it connected to other nodes? How much is it related to other images? Another thing that we looked at is, and this is important for the next slide, is how much are each of these nodes, abstract art paintings, close or far to everything else? So we can look at the, if you remember, the shortest path length across the entire network for all pairs of nodes, or we can just look at the specific starting point, for example, this node here, and ask, how many steps do you need to take from this node to all other nodes? So this is what we call the local shortest path length of a node. How much is it close and more close in the center or in the periphery of this network? Okay, and then we correlated these local node metrics with the subjective preference of these arts. Okay, I hope you're still following, because, well, what's important is this slide. What we found is that only for the semantic-based network, only here, so this is exactly opposite than what was the a priori hypothesis, that only information in the semantic-based network conveyed predictive information, or not predictive at the end of this correlation, but relational information on preference, in the sense that the more, this is the x-axis, the more, or the y-axis relation at the end of this correlation, the more a node was separated from everything else, more in the outskirts of the network, the more it was unique, the more people liked it. So this now allows us to start trying to identify unique aspects of an artwork and whether it is meaningful in how people are comprehending it and appreciating it, and potentially why that is the case. Okay, so this specific project is in essence exciting because of two different things. The first is that it compares sort of different types of information on how abstract art is potentially understood or appreciated. Again, these sort of statistical image properties versus semantically based descriptions. And it shows that the humans still win over the machine, which I think is really important, especially in the age of GPT. And the second is that we can use this network representation to start better understanding or starting to move forward in understanding subjective appreciation of art in this case. All right, perfect. I'm going to end very soon so that there's enough time to any sort of discussion that you like. And this is going to end with the last example, and this is a paper that actually was published a few months ago. And actually, I'm always very sad at talking about this because it's the last project I did working with Anjan, who was a fantastic researcher and a great person, and I can only say good things about him. So this is a different example of how networks can be used to study human behavior, okay? And this study tackles a very heated debate in empirical aesthetics. And this is on the topic of, and this is the paper that, again, came out a couple months ago. This topic is on this idea of whether there is such a thing as aesthetic emotions. So everyone agrees that we have emotions. I hope that's not a surprise. But then the question is whether there are emotions that are unique in relation to aesthetic experiences. When I am in nature and I feel like I am inspired, do I have different types of emotions than I would have by just thinking about an idea or talking with friends? Okay, so is there such a thing as unique aesthetic emotions, or this is one extreme of the argument? The other type of the extreme of the argument is that there is no such thing as aesthetic emotions. There's only emotions, and in aesthetic experiences activates some types of emotions, and non-aesthetic experience activates different types of emotions. Okay, so there's been a lot of back and forth with papers published on this issue, trying to convince folks that are not convincing each other on whether there is such a thing as aesthetic emotions. So we're trying to take a completely different approach on this issue and ask whether we can characterize a space of emotions, a network of emotions across different contexts. And we're looking at 3 different contexts. We started off with 2, and then we added a third one because of reasons that I can go into if anyone wants to hear about. But at the end of the day, we have 3 different contexts, and I'll explain in a second what I mean by that. But so this is a between group design where we have about 100 folks. Well, actually, we started with a lot, about 250, but we had a lot of exclusion that were separated into 3 different conditions: an aesthetic condition, a non-aesthetic condition, and a consumer condition. Okay, and all of these 3, all of the subjects. This is also an online study. In all of these conditions, they did the exact same thing. There were 2 parts to this study. Okay, the first part, which we call the I can't remember the exact term we ended up with, but this is the memory recollection or immersion part. What we asked the participant to do is to think back to an event that was either aesthetic, non-aesthetic, or relating to buying things, consumers. Okay, and write this down right on the computer. Okay, so what we're asking them is, and this is the instructions for the aesthetic condition: think back on an experience that moved you, and we give all these examples where you're deeply engaged in And then we give specific instructions about these types, potentially types of aesthetic experiences, right? You're being moved, you saw an art that you liked, you read a book that inspired you, you listened to music, etc., etc. And we asked them to write in about 250 words. So this is a fairly expressive type of recollection study, because we want them to give as much detail as they can about their experiences. That's going to be important to the second part. What we wanted is we wanted to sort of immerse them back into how they felt when they are thinking about this. Yeah, like if I think about my wedding day, right, very emotional, very aesthetic, there's all these things. So I feel emotional, and then I think about all these emotions. For the non-aesthetic condition, we give the exact same instructions, other than this part where we give examples that potentially push them into non-aesthetic experiences. There's a big debate on, can we actually separate these two things, aesthetic versus non-aesthetic, but we're going to skip that. So this is like listening to a boring lecture, which I hope is not the case today, right now. Listening to a podcast, other things like that. And then we're asking, okay, now write this down for 250 words. And then the consumer condition, we're doing again the exact same thing, but only saying now about buying stuff, clothes, books, food, whatever. So all of the subjects in each of these three conditions, they're doing the exact same thing. They're thinking of an experience that they've gone through in the past, and they're writing about it, okay? And then the next part, part two, is where we now say, okay, regarding the specific experience you just wrote about, here's a questionnaire. And we're using a questionnaire of 75 items that is called the Aesthetic Emotions Scale. So these are emotions, potentially emotions that have been related to aesthetic experiences, okay? And for each of these, this is work that was done in Germany, but there's also an English version. And for each of these statements, they just rate a Likert scale from I agree to not to I don't agree, okay? So I'm saying, think back about your experience and now rate what emotions are relevant to this specific experience. What we then do is, based on all of this data, and for each of these items, we have a label. So this is going to be important for the visualization that we'll see in a second. Now, what we do is we use a network approach that some people call a psychometric network analysis. There's a lot of people these days, mostly coming from the University of Amsterdam, that analyze questionnaires as networks, okay? And there's a whole discussion on how people can do this or not. But we're going to, this is an example of how we can analyze questionnaires, any questionnaire, as a network space. So what we're interested in is whether the network organization of these 75 concepts, how much it is similar or different across these conditions, aesthetic, non-aesthetic, and consumer. And we do also a lot of other things that I won't get into because I'm running out of time, okay? And we analyze the networks, and we visualize them, and we compare them, all these measures, we do all these statistical analysis, etc., etc. But before, just to show that we look at this, we do this sort of very, very rough content analysis across these conditions. We also try to classify them in different categories, and we actually see that, and this is one thing that we were worried about, but people are actually able to come up with these different conditions of recollections. So that's good. And they are very different across the conditions. Yeah, either it's mostly about emotions of being inspired, or in the consumer world, it's also about inspiration and positive affect, but more about sales. And then we look at the networks. This is the most important network, which is about the aesthetic emotions, sort of the aesthetic experiences condition, right? When people are coming up with aesthetic events from their past. And we see that, so each of these nodes now is an item in this questionnaire, okay? And we analyze the organization of the networks, and we look at the communities. We find that there are 5 communities. These 5 communities largely match and replicate previous attempts at classifying different communities or dimensions of aesthetic emotions. And then we're going to look at the other networks and see how well the other two networks are similar to this network and to the community space. And what we find that they're all very different. This is the non-aesthetics, so I hope you can agree that it looks very different. The aesthetic network is much more crunched together, so it has higher connectivity and lower distances than the non-aesthetic networks. And the consumer network, it looks even more different. And our general take-home message from this project for this debate of whether there are aesthetic emotions or not is we're not making a strong stance of whether there is such a thing as aesthetic condition, but rather we want to sort of, from maybe in a creative way, change the perspective on this issue and say that context matters. Context affects differentially how we are activating our cognition and emotions, and that potentially may hopefully at some point put this issue to rest in the sense that there are emotions that are relating to aesthetic experiences, there are emotions that are related to non-aesthetic experiences, and we can start quantifying the differences of context effects on these types of experiences. There's all these caveats in the study, and I invite you all to read it. All right, and I'm going to end in like 5 minutes. So the general message I'm trying to convey here, and this is an art by a local San Francisco artist that I really like, and I actually have this painting in my office, to say that cognition has a lot of complexity in it. Our aesthetics has a lot of complexity in it as well. How we process and understand aesthetics is a really complex thing, even though it comes very intuitively to us. And now we have computational quantitative ways to look at this complexity and try to start seeing the patterns, make order, make sense, and try to better understand regularities and idiosyncratic differences in understanding abstract concepts like beauty and understanding what people are sensitive to for architectural design, and whether there are such things as aesthetic emotions, etc., etc. Right. So that is my general sort of trying to convince you that networks are cool and networks are important in aesthetics. But I want to finish with the last slide, which is this about the sort of things that I do most of my days and not working on aesthetics. So a lot of my work is actually on creativity and knowledge and representing individual-based networks and seeing how they evolve over time when people come up with creative ideas. And also a lot of work that tries to look at neural dynamics and converging across different types of domains, of sort of levels of analysis. My work is centered across this space of using computational tools to represent complex behavior, complex thinking, and abstract concepts. And a lot of my research in the last definitely year or so, but even more, is focused on this issue of information-seeking behavior, how we ask questions, curiosity, and how question asking helps us acquire information, knowledge, how that impacts our knowledge base, and how we use our knowledge to constantly make a meaning of the world. I also work on clinical populations and do all these different types of things. And in principle, if anyone is interested in walking down this path, this is again an open invitation to create discussions about different domains. This is such a general approach, but is extremely powerful. And a lot of really, I think, unique insights have come out from using this approach to study cognition psychology and the brain. And with that, thank you very much.
Well, thanks a lot for your presentation. I think that a lot of food for thought. So I expect that there will be many comments and questions. So let's start.
Yeah, thank you for a good talk. It was very nice and interesting to listen to many applications of network science. Could you please elaborate a bit more how you calculate these clusters of nodes? What was the mechanism used?
So cluster. So well, yeah. There's many different clustering approaches, right? In networks, the term that is pretty much equivalent is modularity. Modularity maximization is the approach. This was developed by Mark Newman, who's a mathematician, and then constantly being updated across other people. And the way that you do this is you try to take a network. So you either try to take specific nodes and build them into different communities with increasing size and see what is sort of as an optimization, as a bottom-up optimization problem, or you can take a network that you have and try to break it apart into smaller clusters to find the smallest set of nodes in a cluster that stay connected. So there's different approaches in how to identify networks, but the term to remember is modularity maximization approaches.
Okay, thank you. And how about the not the nodes, but the links? What was the link connection? Is it weighted network graph or it's something else?
Yeah, really important question, and also fairly debated one. So one, across these 4 examples, right, the edges were computed differently. Again, this is a project-specific analysis, and as I said in the beginning, this is the biggest open issue. How do we define the edges? Most of my work analyzes the networks as unweighted. That means that we just binarize the edges, even though they're mostly based on correlation strength, just because of a sort of a decision that I've made a long time ago, in the sense that I feel like I still don't know what these edges theoretically mean. So, and even in physical systems, like in brain networks, most of the research still looks at unweighted networks. And I think this is something that we need to move forward from. And there is more work that has been done in the past sort of 5 years in that direction. But there's still much more that we need to move forward in and to better understand, really characterizing what these weights, how important are these weights are. Because in the past, the math and the computation of the math were more complicated for weighted networks. And then people, I think, just got used to analyzing these networks as unweighted. And I think that's something that we need to move from.
I would like, I think my question is outdated now because one problem with the networks is thresholding. And
that's a really big problem.
Yes, and one way I found is this minimum spanning tree, which I'm using because another way I'm great fan of weighted networks, but undirected yet. Yeah, okay, so it gets more and more complicated, and thresholding is really a big.
So there's different approaches, and this sort of issue of filtering or thresholding is an open problem, and it really also is content sort of domain dependent.
Yes,
and how much people care about this. But what I was going to suggest when you brought this up is to use what I call information filtering approaches that MST is a part of, but there's also planar maximal filter graph and triangulated maximal filter graph, work by Tommaso Aste from UCL in London. He's developed a lot of these filters that have been used from economic networks to cognitive networks and other domains, and also brain networks. So yes, I personally believe in filtering this sort of thresholding, having no control about the threshold, because when we start including these arbitrary decisions about
exactly,
this is means to I get worried.
Exactly.
So again, it's not a close, and so one solution that I've done is also use just weighted networks, and that's in a way solves that problem. It just creates other problems. So it's always sort of a pro-con sort of decision that you need to make.
Right. It's very nice that, especially in the beginning of your talk, that what you found using this network approach was also found using other methods, which proves the method, which is really good thing.
Yeah, no, I'm a true believer in that sense. But there has been good work, psychometric work. Hudson Galino has done that work. Alex Christensen, who I've worked with in the past, have been really focusing on showing how equivalent these methods are to each other. But then again, as I said before, want to argue that the network approach conveys additional information that is unique to this specific approach, and which is why I think it's a much more powerful methodological approach. Any other question? I scared you by saying that I'm not an expert, but you can ask me questions. I'm happy to. I'm studying question asking, so I'm always interested in hearing people's questions.
Well, did you try to use as a measure something like from some mutual information, if it's possible? What do you know about this method?
For mutual information, definitely can. I haven't, and I'm trying to think of how to use that. Yeah, definitely there is a possibility. Either as a way to maybe define the edges between nodes in the network. I think that's very straightforward, or as a way to sort of predict maybe how network properties can predict some sort of out dependent variable that is about mutual information. So in principle, for sure, it's possible. I don't have anything that pops to mind on how to. But yes, the short answer is I haven't done this. I don't think I haven't done this, but I see how it can be implemented in different times. And I'm sure someone has used mutual information in network analysis. I can't think of anything right now.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
So overall, this is such a general approach. This is also its biggest weakness in the sense that as an empirical researcher, I want to study theoretical concepts, and then this is all at the end of the day linear algebra, just square matrices and all these math that is people developed, and a lot of the effort is to sort of convince that these network measures have theoretical significance. And I and others have written several review papers and constantly try to promote the use of this approach in cognitive psychology, because for some reason people are a little bit more reserved about this, even though in neural research it has really revolutionized the field of human neuroscience, not just human neuroscience. So if anyone's interested, again, there are review papers. There's also all of this is available through accessible tools in any language: C, Python, R, MATLAB, whatever you use. There's a network package these days. It's that popular and accessible. And if anyone wants to know more about how to potentially implement anything, I'm always happy if you reach out to me and I can tell you about it. So point you or help you, whatever is your interest. So use network analysis. It's the most exciting thing. No, I'm kidding. I'm biased in this, but I think it has a lot of strength in asking questions.
Piotr?
Hey, so one comment, whatever your language start off, Mathematica, Python, you're gonna end up using C++ or C, because these are the only actually sufficiently fast and sufficiently efficient languages which implement neural network systems. This is my experience of working with neural networks in Witoria Kolica lab, that each student started with Python or whatever, and always they end up with C++ by the end of their PhD. And the other question is,
I stuck with MATLAB, and other people use R. So I just want to quantify that I'm not talking about neural or artificial neural network analysis. I'm talking about
no. It's just when they get sufficiently big, it
I completely agree. Definitely
starts to choke your computation.
Memory is a problem.
So pardon me for a rookie question, but are these cognitive networks, they are just like psychological concept, or they are rooted in somehow in neurological science, in brain science?
It's a really important question. So far it's studied separately. But in cognitive science or in psychology, there's 100 years of research on memory and language. So now these two, but a lot of theory and for example, I mentioned this before, the most basic concept in cognitive psychology is what's called semantic priming, is the idea that when I am shown, so the experiment is the following. People see the word line, and then they are either asked to say whether stripes is related to line or table is related to line. And people are always quicker to say line is related to, stripes is related to line than a table is related to line. The idea there, based on this theory, is that people think of this concept line, and that activates the conceptual knowledge of line, stripes, whatever, animal, etc. Networks allow us to empirically study these theoretical ideas. Till we start using networks and other computation methods. Again, I don't want to downplay other work that is really important. A lot of this work was studied in indirect ways. Again, people just by studying how quick people respond and trying to make inferences on how people's mental representations are organized. These tools allow us to try and better sort of tease out the signal. This is where we are advancing towards it. So, right, a lot of the work is not sort of tied down into neurological level, the neural mechanisms, the hardware of the system, but there are questions. How is knowledge represented in neural activation, and whether there is a matching? What is the matching of how I'm thinking about concepts and how my brain is allowing me to think about that? This is, again, an open question that people have moved forward in understanding neural representations of knowledge and information, and these tools are allowing us to move slowly forward into trying to better converge this sort of abstract psychological constructs and this more physiological neural constructs together. So it's a really important question, and it's still unsolved. This is a question of, and I think this is where it's exciting. There's so much work that we need to do, and the more we move towards this sort of complex behavior of thinking, the harder it is, because thinking involves a lot of cognitive capacities that are working together, and this was in the past very hard to empirically study. And this is where we have made a lot of progress in the last 2 decades, mostly because of the use of computational tools like networks.
I got one question. It's maybe a little bit off topic, but concerning this research on abstract art paintings, because it seems to me that there are some of the measures that you used in this paper are concerns. I would say there's some kind of information capacity of the object. For example, it seems to me that the isotropic objects are much conveys anisotropic objects conveys much more information than isotropic objects, and so on. Are there any correlations between preferences and these kind of measures that are, important from the information point of view, or informational point of view?
Well, for the specific measure that we looked at, we didn't find anything. It doesn't mean that there isn't, and maybe our our sample, our network was too small, right? There's also issues of power. Maybe we didn't have enough power. So again, it was just a demonstration of the sort of questions that we can ask. And again, abstract art research is also very minimal. There's not a lot of people doing that type of research. So yeah, I think this is a really important question. And again, it's just one more thing that people should and can look at.
One more question, if may I, is one important thing when you investigate people are people themselves. Like the socioeconomic status, which I think is matters very much, how they see the things and how they understand the world. So how they answer your questions, and of course personality traits as well. So that means I guess that the group was quite homogeneous, so it was not a additional factor, but across these factors like socioeconomic status, investigation could show a completely different networks, I guess.
Of
or
course,
maybe not completely, but different.
So there's a lot of individual variance that is important, and we in any of these four examples we did not look at. So yeah, personalities is. I've done work on analyzing personality questionnaires as networks. That's a different thing. I'm happy to talk about. But one important thing that is also like an elephant in the room is expertise. So maybe how different are the sort of representations of people that were expert in art or just go to museums a lot versus people that have not gone to museums. These factors really matter and definitely impact cognitive systems or cognitive representations of knowledge and our appreciation of aesthetics. We always ask demographic questions and we try to control for that, but definitely there's variance and noise that we're not. So all of the network approaches that I briefly showed you today, they're actually all very conservative. They all try to really match as much as possible everything to control for as many variables as possible. There's always going to be noise, and that calls for one, replication studies, and two, individual-based network analysis of all of this, which again we didn't do in any of these examples. And there are ways to do that, but like in every method, there's pros and cons for anything. So for sure, I completely agree. And people are complex. This is what's cool. But we now can study this complexity, and this is something that I'm very excited about.
We have time left for one question. So if we have no more questions for our guests, thank you very much for your excellent talk.
Thanks.
I'm very happy to have you here today. And so, Piotr, you have one more question?
No, I just clicked icon for clapping hands. So.
Okay.
Thanks.
So
thanks everybody. Have a good night. And again, if anyone has any questions, please reach out to me. I'm always happy to talk about all of this and develop collaborations.
So thanks a lot.
Right.
And I hope to see you next time. The next meeting of our seminar will be on March 12th, and I will inform you soon about the speaker and the topic. And for today, thank you very much, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.